A piece of paper ended a war. Not a treaty. Not a peace accord. Not even a formal agreement between two governments. A memorandum. And the moment it was signed, oil markets moved, shipping lanes reopened, and 46 years of frozen assets suddenly had a price tag attached to them. But here's the thing nobody is talking about. This document, the US-Iran Memorandum of Understanding, is not a peace deal. It is not a nuclear agreement. And it is definitely not the end of the story. It is, in many ways, the beginning of the most consequential financial and geopolitical renegotiation of the 21st century. And if you don't understand what's actually written inside it, what it says, what it doesn't say, and what it sets up for the next 5 to 10 years, you are going to misread everything that comes after. So today, we are going to open this document. We are going to read between the lines. And we are going to follow the money. Because in history, it's never the bombs that tell the whole story. It's always the paperwork. Part 1, How We Got Here. The 46 year to understand what this memorandum means, you have to go back. Not to last year, not to the Trump administration, you have to go back to November 4th, 1979. That is the day 52 American diplomats and embassy staff were taken hostage inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. The crisis lasted 444 days, and when it ended, through the Algiers Accords of January 1981, the United States and Iran technically settled their immediate dispute. But they never closed the wound. What came next was 4 decades of economic warfare. The U.S. froze Iranian assets. Iran retaliated through proxies, through oil strategy, through regional influence. The sanctions piled up, layer upon layer upon layer. By the time we reached 2024, Iran was operating under some of the most comprehensive sanctions ever imposed on any country in modern history. Think about that for a second. Iran, a country with over 80 million people, the second largest proven gas reserves on the planet, and one of the oldest civilizations in human history, had been almost completely cut off from the global financial system. No SWIFT access, no dollar transactions, oil exports strangled, foreign assets frozen in accounts across Europe, South Korea, Japan, and Iraq. The total figure of frozen Iranian assets at various points was estimated at somewhere between $100 and $150 billion, depending on who you ask and which accounts you count. That is not a sanction. That is economic suffocation. And Iran responded the way any cornered state responds. It built leverage. It accelerated its nuclear program, not necessarily to build a bomb, but to have a bargaining chip. It armed proxy groups across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. It developed drone and missile capabilities that made the entire Gulf region nervous. And it partnered quietly, strategically, with Russia and China to build alternative financial and trade corridors that bypassed the dollar entirely. By 2025, the situation had become genuinely dangerous. Iran had enriched uranium to levels that put it weeks, not months away from weapons-grade material. U.S. carrier groups were deployed to the Gulf. Israel was conducting strikes on Iranian nuclear infrastructure. The Houthis were hitting Red Sea shipping. And the Strait of Hormuz, the single most important oil choke point on Earth, through which 20% of the world's oil flows every single day, was under implicit threat. The world was looking at a potential regional war that could spike oil to $150 a barrel overnight. Something had to give. And that is exactly where this memorandum enters the picture. Part 2. What is a Memorandum of Understanding, and why not a treaty? Before we get into what's actually inside this document, we need to understand what kind of document it actually is. Because this is where most of the media coverage gets lazy. They call it a deal. They call it an agreement. Some even call it a treaty. But it is none of those things. And the distinction matters enormously. A treaty is a formal, legally binding agreement between two sovereign states. It has to be ratified. In the United States, that means 2/3 of the Senate must approve it. Given the current political climate around Iran, that was never going to happen. A formal executive agreement is slightly below a treaty, still binding under international law, but enacted through presidential authority alone. A Memorandum of Understanding, an MOU, is something different entirely. It is a declaration of intent. It outlines what both sides agree to in principle. It sets a framework. But it is not automatically enforceable under domestic or international law the way a treaty is. And this is not an accident. The United States chose an MOU deliberately, because an MOU can be negotiated faster. It doesn't require Senate ratification. It gives the executive branch maximum flexibility. And critically, it can be modified, suspended, or withdrawn more easily than a treaty. That last point is important, because it means this document is built with an exit ramp already embedded into its structure. Iran understood this. The Iranians are sophisticated negotiators. They've been doing this for decades. With the JCPOA in 2015, with the Algiers Accords in 1981, with endless back-channel negotiations in between. They knew exactly what they were signing. So why did they agree to an MOU rather than push for something more binding? Because they needed relief now, not in 2 years after Senate ratification, now. And the Americans needed stability in the Gulf now, not after a procedural battle in Congress, now. So both sides accepted the ambiguity, both sides accepted the impermanence, and both sides quietly understood that what was written in this document was not the whole story. The real negotiation, the harder negotiation, was about what comes next. But first let's talk about what is actually in this thing. Part 3, inside the document. The 5 core pillars. The U.S.-Iran Memorandum of Understanding, as it has been publicly described and partially disclosed, is built around 5 core areas. I'm going to walk you through each one, and after each one, I'm going to tell you what it actually means in plain financial and geopolitical terms, because the official language and the real-world implications are often two very different things. Pillar 1, the ceasefire and military de-escalation framework. The first pillar of the MOU is a mutual commitment to halt direct and proxy military hostilities. On the American side, this means pausing further strikes on Iranian-linked targets in the region, specifically in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. On the Iranian side, this means reining in the Houthis in Yemen and directing Hezbollah and other proxy groups to stand down from active escalation. Now, here's the critical thing to understand about this pillar. It does not dismantle these proxy networks. It does not require Iran to permanently withdraw its influence from these countries. It is a pause, a deliberate, strategic pause, not a structural disarmament. What this means in practice is that both sides preserve their leverage for the next phase of negotiations, while removing the immediate risk of miscalculation, the kind of miscalculation that starts wars nobody actually wanted. Think of it as 2 chess players agreeing to pause the clock. The pieces are still on the board. The game is still in progress. Pillar 2, nuclear program limitations. This is the pillar that got the most headlines, and it is the most technically complex. Under the MOU's nuclear terms, Iran has agreed to cap uranium enrichment at a specific level publicly reported at 60%, stepping back from the 84 to 90% weapons-grade threshold that IAEA inspectors had flagged with alarm. In exchange, certain centrifuge installations, particularly the advanced IR-6 centrifuges at Fordow and Natanz, will be placed under enhanced IAEA monitoring, though not dismantled. Here is what that means in plain language. Iran is not giving up its nuclear program. It is not rolling it back to 2015 JCPOA levels. It is agreeing to freeze it at a level that keeps it below the immediate weapons threshold, while keeping all the infrastructure intact. This is a temporary cap, not a permanent ceiling. And both sides know it. The Americans needed to be able to say Iran is not a nuclear state. Iran needed to be able to say it has not surrendered its deterrent capability. This language lets both sides say exactly that. Pillar 3. Sanctions relief. The financial architecture. This is the pillar that matters most to the Iranian economy, and frankly it's the most financially interesting part of this entire document. The MOU outlines a phased conditional sanctions relief structure. In Phase 1, immediate measures, the United States agrees to release a tranche of frozen Iranian assets held in third-party countries. The figure that has been publicly discussed is in the range of $6 to $10 billion initially, with additional tranches tied to compliance benchmarks. South Korea and Japan, who were holding billions in frozen Iranian oil revenues, were among the first to begin the transfer process under U.S. authorization. In Phase 2, medium-term measures, the MOU creates a pathway for Iran to begin limited oil exports to specific buyers. China, which has been quietly purchasing Iranian oil for years in defiance of sanctions, gets a formalized carve-out. India, which has significant refinery capacity designed specifically for Iranian crude, gets a partial waiver. In Phase 3, longer-term measures, the document outlines a framework for negotiating broader sanctions removal, contingent on a future formal nuclear agreement and continued compliance. Verification. Now listen carefully to what I just said. Phase 3 is contingent on a future agreement, meaning the sanctions architecture, the full economic normalization, is not happening under this MOU. It is being dangled as the reward for the next deal. This is classic American negotiating strategy. Give just enough relief to keep the other side at the table, but keep the most valuable concessions for the next round. Iran knows this, but they also know that $6 to $10 billion in immediate asset releases, plus resumed oil export revenue, buys them significant breathing room domestically. The Iranian rial had collapsed. Inflation was running catastrophically high. The regime needed an economic win, and this gives them one they can show their population. Pillar 4. The Strait of Hormuz Guarantee. This might be the most strategically significant pillar that received the least public attention. The MOU includes a mutual commitment to freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz and the broader Persian Gulf shipping lanes. Iran agrees not to interfere with commercial shipping, including oil tankers, transiting the strait. In exchange, the United States provides certain implicit security guarantees around the broader Gulf and agrees to a mechanism for de-escalating any future maritime incidents before they spiral. Now think about what this means for global oil markets. The Strait of Hormuz handles roughly 17 to 21 million barrels of oil per day. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, and Qatar all depend on it. If that strait gets closed, even for 48 hours, oil prices spike globally. Insurance rates for shipping skyrocket. Supply chains seize up. The moment this pillar was included in the MOU, you saw a specific and measurable response in oil futures markets. The geopolitical risk premium that traders had been pricing into crude, that extra $8 to $15 per barrel that reflected potential Gulf closure, began to compress. That is not a coincidence. That is markets That is not a coincidence. That is markets reading the document and repricing accordingly. Pillar 5. The Prisoner and Diplomatic Exchange Framework. The final pillar is the most humanly visible, but the least economically consequential. The MOU establishes a framework for the phased release of dual nationals and prisoners held on both sides, and opens a back-channel diplomatic communication mechanism. Not full embassies, but something closer to a permanent dialogue structure routed potentially through Oman, which has historically served as the intermediary between Washington and Tehran. This pillar matters symbolically. It shows domestic populations on both sides that the agreement has human faces attached to it. And the communication channel matters operationally, because without a direct line, every misunderstanding becomes a crisis. Part 4. What the document doesn't say. 11/30/1430. Now here is where things get genuinely interesting, because what an agreement leaves out is often more telling than what it includes. The MOU does not address Iran's ballistic missile program. Not a single line. This was a red line for Israel and a major demand from hardline American voices. It is completely absent from the document. Why? Because Iran made it absolutely clear, before negotiations even began, that its missile program was non-negotiable. It is Iran's conventional deterrent in the absence of nuclear weapons, and without it, Iran argued, it had no security guarantee whatsoever. The Americans accepted this, or more accurately, they deferred it. Missile program limitations are likely being reserved for a future, more comprehensive nuclear deal. Another chip kept off the table for the next round of poker. The MOU also does not address Iran's role in Lebanon through Hezbollah in any permanent structural sense. It doesn't require Iran to cut off Hezbollah's funding. It doesn't require Iran to stop weapons transfers. It simply requires Iran to direct Hezbollah to maintain a reduced operational posture for the duration of the MOU's framework period. The moment this MOU lapses, or is violated, that restraint evaporates. The document also does not include any ironclad enforcement mechanism. There is no international court with jurisdiction over violations. There is no automatic snapback sanction trigger built into the text the way the JCPOA had one. The consequences of violation are essentially political and diplomatic, meaning both sides have to decide case by case how to respond. This is a feature for the negotiators and a bug for everyone who wants long-term stability. And finally, the MOU does not resolve the fundamental question of what Iran is actually allowed to become in the regional order. Is Iran a legitimate regional power with a sphere of influence the way Russia has Ukraine's neighborhood or China has the South China Sea? Or is Iran a rogue state that must be permanently contained? The United States and Iran have never agreed on the answer to that question, and this memorandum does not answer it either. It simply postpones the confrontation. Part 5. The Financial and Geopolitical Implications. Who actually won? So after reading all of that, after walking through every pillar and every gap, you are probably asking the same question everyone is asking. Who won? And the honest answer is, it depends on what game you think was being played. If you think the game was about stopping Iran from getting a nuclear weapon immediately, the United States won. The 60% enrichment cap and the enhanced monitoring buy time. And time in non-proliferation is everything. If you think the game was about Iran's long-term survival as an independent regional power, Iran won. They got asset releases. They got oil export pathways. They kept their missile program. They kept their proxy network. They kept their nuclear infrastructure intact. They survived the maximum pressure campaign without surrendering their core strategic assets. If you think the game was about oil market stability, Saudi Arabia and the UAE won. The Strait of Hormuz guarantee and the ceasefire framework remove the immediate catastrophic tail risk from Gulf oil. Riyadh and Abu Dhabi can plan their economic diversification programs, Vision 2030 for example, without a regional war blowing up their timeline. If you think the game was about China's strategic position, Beijing won quietly and decisively. The formalized oil carve-out. China means Iranian crude keeps flowing to Chinese refineries. China deepens its energy security without spending $1 on the negotiation. And every dollar of Iranian oil that flows to China rather than dollar-denominated markets is another incremental step away from petrodollar dominance. And if you think the game was about the long-term restructuring of Middle Eastern geopolitics, the game is still in the first quarter. This MOU is not an endgame, it is a halftime. The real question, the one that will define the next decade, is whether this framework survives long enough to become something more permanent. And the historical record on that question is not encouraging. Part 6. The Historical Parallel. Why Must Fail. History is littered with memoranda of understanding that were supposed to change everything and instead became footnotes. The 1994 Agreed Framework between the United States and North Korea. Both sides agreed to freeze North Korea's nuclear program in exchange for energy assistance and a path toward normalization. It lasted 8 years before collapsing entirely. North Korea went on to test nuclear weapons. The 1995 Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine gave up the nuclear weapons it inherited from the Soviet Union in exchange for security guarantees from the United States, Russia, and Britain. We all know how that ended. The JCPOA itself, the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, was not a treaty. It was an executive agreement, and in 2018, the United States unilaterally withdrew from it. The pattern is consistent. When great powers sign non-binding frameworks with adversaries, those frameworks are only as durable as the domestic political will that sustains them on both sides. And right now, on both sides of this MOU, that domestic political will is fragile. In the United States, the next administration may view this document the same way the Trump administration viewed the JCPOA. In Iran, hardliners within the Revolutionary Guard and the clerical establishment never fully accepted engagement with Washington. The supreme leader's own ideological legacy is built on resistance to American imperialism. This MOU can survive. It has more specific economic incentives attached to it than some of its predecessors. The asset releases and oil export pathways create constituencies on the American business and energy side who benefit from stability. But it is not guaranteed. And anyone who tells you this document has secured lasting peace is selling you something. Here is the thought I want to leave you with. The Memorandum of Understanding between the United States and Iran is not a resolution. It is a negotiated pause between two countries that have been locked in a cold economic and geopolitical war for nearly half a century. It is significant. It is consequential. It will move markets, reshape alliances, and open corridors that have been closed for decades. But the deeper conflict, the argument about who controls the Persian Gulf, who dominates the regional order, who gets to be a great power, and who gets sanctioned into submission, that conflict has not been resolved. It has been rescheduled. And the next chapter of this story will be written not in the language of diplomats and memoranda, it will be written in the language of oil prices, bond markets, currency flows, and proxy wars conducted just below the threshold of open conflict. That is the language we study here. That is the lens we use to read history, not through the headlines, but through the financial architecture underneath them. If you want to keep reading history that way, through the balance sheets, the asset freezes, the sanctions regimes, and the backroom deals that actually shape the world, then you already know what to do. This channel exists for people who are not satisfied with the surface-level story. It exists for people who want to know what the document actually says. I'll see you in the next one.